I'm Matt.
Hey, I'm Steve.
Hey, I'm John.
This is the Sober Friends Podcast. We're here for the sober curious, the new guy, and the old timer. We're here to talk about the stuff anyone looking to live alcohol-free has to face day to day, and how we overcame those struggles. We speak for no 12-step group, but we do try to remain anonymous. You're not alone. This is the Sober Friends Podcast. We seem to have eliminated all of our guests from the continental United States, Steve.
Yeah.
The only people we ever talk to are people outside our borders, and this is so great that we have the technology to do this, but now we're going north as opposed to going south.
Yeah.
We're going north to Canada. Our guest this week is the host of the Happiest Sober podcast, Madeline Forrest. Madeline, welcome to the Sober Friends Podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy that we finally connected here.
I know. It was a long time coming, so I'm really excited for it.
It's pretty much like that with every guest. It's like, if I want to get a good guest on, it's like I have to start today, and it'll be, a month or two, and we'll get to it. So it's like always have someone in the hopper.
Oh, I love that.
There it goes.
So Madeline, what brings you here? You're on the dark side of alcohol. If you're talking to us, you're not one of these normies.
I'm not a normie.
So what's your story?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, I was raised by a sober mom, which I'm always so thankful for. My mom got sober when she was 21. So she's going on 40 years next month.
Ooh,
which
how did she get sober at 21? I would have loved to get sober at 21.
I know, right? Yeah, she had one day one. She walked into AA at 21 and never looked back. So I was raised by her, which I think is a big part of why I got sober when I did, for sure. I think I would have gotten sober a lot older if that wasn't the case. But my parents, when they got married, my dad was also sober. And when I was a kid, he relapsed. And so because of that, my parents split up, and my dad was kind of like pretty absent while my sisters and I were growing up. So I grew up in a house where alcohol was a very, very big topic of conversation. Like, it was something my mom was very open with us about. My mom hated rules, but she had one, and it was we're not allowed to drink. And we all followed that. I never drank until my mom told me I was allowed to drink. And so when I very first did drink and get drunk, and I really did, I had this mentality growing up of I never want to drink. I never want to drink to get drunk. I had sort of all of this knowledge going into it. But when I did first drink, it quickly became something I really loved to do. But the very first time I ever got drunk, I woke up the next day with so much anxiety, crippling anxiety. And I wasn't someone who struggled with anxiety before that. And that stayed with me for the whole 10 years that I drank. I always really, really struggled with anxiety the next day, and a lot of shame the next day. And it just got progressively worse and worse and worse. And I think I existed on sort of the gray area of the spectrum. I never really hit a rock bottom. I didn't have really many external consequences of my drinking, but I definitely drank too much. I knew it was problematic, and it really, really affected my mental health. And that was eventually what gave me the push to get sober, was just I can't keep feeling this way anymore. I just kind of hit my own emotional bottom of being done with it.
So when you talk about anxiety, do you know, what were you anxious about? Were you afraid of your behavior? What was that? I'm assuming you'd done some work trying to figure out some of that, what was going on. What was going on there?
Yeah. Oh my God. It was I would wake up in the morning, and I would, whether or not, sometimes I didn't remember the night, sometimes I did, but if I didn't, I would just be worst case scenario, what did I do? What did I say? Did I embarrass myself? Are people mad at me? If I did remember the night, I would be but what if I think I remembered the night and I don't, and I did something awful that I don't even know that I don't remember? It was just worst case scenario. And I think what's interesting is that I have read a lot now. When I got sober, I read up on the fact that alcohol actually chemically causes anxiety, which I never knew when I was going through it. But I think also because of the upbringing I had, and because of what a big topic of conversation alcohol was. And I think I had this mentality of like the first time I got drunk, I think I felt heightened shame about it because I knew so much. And I think I was hard on myself and felt very like, oh, I've done something really wrong here by getting drunk. Like, I think that did play into it as well for me.
Yeah, it's just interesting because I grew up with an not a sober mom. I grew up with an alcoholic mom who did get sober, but throughout my formative years, especially, she was not. And it's funny because it's not funny, but it's interesting because I too watched my mom and like, oh, I'm not going to do that, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to be an alcoholic. I'm not going to drink like my mom. I'm not going to do any of the things that she's doing. And in the end, I ended up the exact same place, and I mean the exact same place. So yeah, AA tells us self-knowledge will not fix us, and I'm a perfect example of that. I know self-knowledge can't fix me because I know everything there is, and I had a relapse in my story too. So so it's interesting, and I agree. I think the shame on you because your mom was sober was probably so much more. And the fact that you guys talked about it so much when you were younger, and it really put some shame and anxiety into you.
Yeah. Do you think it heightened it for you as well because of your mom in the opposite way, though?
I didn't feel that. I'm sure it did. Especially, I didn't get to that point for a long time, but I'm sure it did. And I'm sure at the end when I started realizing, like, oh man, I'm at this same exact spot, drinking myself to passing out every night. It was a lot of disappointment, I think, right? In myself, right? In myself, because at that time, my mom was sober.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right. So she had gotten sober. And again, I don't want to tell my story here, but she had gotten sober on her own, no help that we know of. But so at that point she was sober, and here I was in my late 30s, walking into the rooms of AA, Yeah. But anyway, so, it's just interesting to hear some of that same story.
Yeah, how much like watching our parents, no matter kind of what their story is, it can really play into how we feel about our own, for sure.
The anxiety situation I can totally relate to because I had the same situation. And I knew the difference in the anxiety of general anxiety and the day after drinking. Because the only way I can describe it is when I drink too much caffeine, I start getting jittery and my blood sugar starts to get kind of crazy. And I know it's absolutely linked to the coffee, and that anxiety just felt different. It felt like this is definitely chemically induced. When I drink too much, I feel that zing, and I am off to the races and feel terrified. While you were talking to that, if I had the saber dance sound effect, that's that music where you see like the jugglers, juggling the plates, that's what I feel your soundtrack would be, the way you described it. Of that, you're juggling with the drinks and that feeling of the pounding music there, and almost in control but not. So if you're brand new and you feel some of those things, you're listening to the right podcast, you're listening to the right people, because this is normal if you're drinking too much.
It totally is, and it was awful. It was crippling for me. Absolutely crippling.
So you realized you needed to do something about it, and then what do you do? What happens?
So and it's so funny, I woke up after the most uneventful night of drinking ever. Nothing had gone wrong. I was just like with one of my closest friends. I woke up, I had a text from her like, thanks for such a great night, love you. Like, no reason to feel that way, but I did. I felt so low. So I decided like my sister's 30th was like a few weeks away. And I was like, that's my end date. I'm quitting after her birthday. And I started looking at sober Instagram accounts, which was super, super helpful for me at that time. I got honest with my mom about it for the first time in ways that I hadn't. She ended up being my main like support system through that time. I read so many books. Like I was obsessed with Quit Lit. I read more than I've ever read in like my early sobriety. And I joined a virtual support group called the Luckiest Club, which is hosted by Laura McCowan, author of the book We Are the Luckiest. Yeah, those
she's a
were
big
kind
deal
of
in
my
the community.
Yeah,
Huge
she was a
podcast
big
she has.
deal. Yeah. Those were kind of the main things that I did. But yeah, it was hard and it was really scary. It's freaking scary to take that leap and to even just like get honest with yourself and like almost like come out to people about it. Especially when you're not someone like, for me, a lot of people in my life didn't realize I struggled with drinking the way that I did. It looked pretty okay from the outside, so it's scary to kind of fess up about it.
Yeah.
What was scariest?
Yeah.
What was the one thing that you think was that got you most terrified to do this?
I think just the feeling of like, once I say this, there's no turning back. Because even if even though technically, yes, I could say this and then go back to drinking, then I'll feel like a failure. I'll feel like people are going to be like judging me drinking. Like, it was very much like, for me, I wasn't ready to really tell people until I was ready to commit to it. So that was
felt
the
the
scary
same
part for
way.
me. Yeah.
That was one of my big issues is I could tell people I'm not drinking for now, but as soon as I said I'm not drinking anymore because I have a problem or I'm an alcoholic or the alcohol use disorder, however you want to identify, if I do that, then I can't go back because you'll point your finger at me.
Yes.
And that was my greatest fear, that I didn't want to be called by you, hey, you got a problem, you better stop.
Yeah, it's like a way of it's a freaking accountability tool to tell people because then you can't go, like, even if you go back, you feel like you're going back with their judgment and them watching you. And that was a scary part for me for sure.
A couple things, if you're new and listening to this, or if you're, like I said, you're just looking for you're wondering about your own drinking, is it can be scary. It can be scary at the beginning, and it can be hard to raise your hand if you go to AA and say, "Hey, I'm an alcoholic," or whatever it is. Tell a friend or tell a supporter of some type and say, "I think I have a problem." That's a really, really big step. So, if you're out there and you're thinking, "Oh, I'm afraid to do that," that's okay. That's okay that you're afraid to do that. I think we were all afraid of somehow. I know when I came in, I had a pretty bad, it was a pretty bad bottom drinking wise. So it was a little bit easier for me. It's easier when you have a bad bottom. It's one of those things where if you don't have, like you said, you had a normal night of drinking, and it's pretty hard to say, oh, I'm sure if you called up that friend that you were out with and said, hey, I think I have a problem, she would have probably said, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Right? Because she doesn't know. But when you talk to somebody like your mom who sort of understands it, then she can appreciate it a little bit more. So it's not easy, but man, is it worth it?
Yeah. It's a very, very brave thing for anybody to do, for sure. Yeah.
I think this is a little aside, Steve, but I am curious when we talk about Quit Lit, what I think about a Laura McCallan, or I think of Laura Cathcart Robbins with her book Stash, or Annie Grace. Annie Grace is one of the big ones with like recovery literature. How much do you think that non-conference approved literature gets read with AA members? Is that like an outside of AA thing, or do you think that people do read that? Because I feel like
no, I think it's
that's
outside
for the others.
I do. I think it's outside for the most part. And we just talked about this last week, right, with our guest, is the same thing. It seems like women do a lot more Quit Lit reading than men do. At least the men I know, right? But most of the men I know are AA guys. So, and some of them are very much like, listen, Matt and I do a lot of that stuff. We, because we share some stuff of what we're reading and things like that. But I think for most people in AA, it's pretty much standard. You're gonna stay with some of the stuff, conference approved stuff. I just like to read, so I like reading some of that stuff. And
I'm curious. I think the conference approved literature is good, and I think there's a place for the other stuff just to keep current on what's going on.
Oh, me too. Oh, without question. I don't think there's any question that there's a lot of really good stuff out there now. And it's hard. It's really hard because, like we talked about last week, a lot of it's written by women. And I think that's why women are attracted to it, because they can identify with it a little bit more. And I think that may be why some of the guys stay away from it, So.
Madeline, how did your mom take all of this? because I'm the parent of 3 kids, 15, 11, and 9. And my greatest terror is my kids become alcoholics or they have problems with drinking and drugs. And my 15-year-old has never drank before, and he's told me, I'm never going to drink because this is a family issue. And I'm like, you can't make that decision yet. And I love that you're saying that, and I'm afraid that you can't commit to that yet. But I think empathizing from your mom, how did she deal with this? Was she terrorized by this? What was that like?
She was, oh my God, she handled it so well. And, you know, like she had seen the red flags. Like she knew that, like she watched me drink a lot of wine and thought like, oh, down the road, that's not going to be a great thing. But she had no idea the suffering that I was actually going through with it at the time. Because I didn't want her to know, because I didn't want to out myself to her. So she didn't know I was struggling in the way that I was at all. But she was so supportive, and she made it really safe for me because she really gave me the space to figure it out on my own while I was trying to figure it out. Like she didn't make it feel like I had to get sober for her because she wanted me to. She was kind of just like a sounding board, even when I was like in my phase of like trying to figure out what I needed to do and what I wanted to do and what this was and all of that. So she was a support, and yeah, she was my biggest cheerleader, and she was like, oh God, I don't think I could have done it without her when I did, but she was excited for me. Like I remember having oh my God, I called her every day, and we were in lockdown, right? It was COVID times, and right. I remember so many times calling her crying and being like, I'm never gonna have fun again, and life's never gonna be the same again, and her being like, Maddie, you're going to love it. I promise you, you're going to love it. Your life is going to get so much better. Like, cause my mom really, like, I mean, she was a great role model for me. She's lived a very just happy, sober life. She doesn't miss out on anything. She lives her life to the fullest and does things and just does them without drinking. So she's a great example of that, but I still had trouble believing it at the time when I was kind of in my grieving phase of alcohol. But no, she was very, very supportive, and yeah, it's been an awesome thing for us to kind of bond over, and it's made me understand her better because there are so many conversations we never would have had if I hadn't gone through getting sober, because she's been sober my whole life. I never thought to ask her that much about it, and then when I was going through it, I had a million questions for her of like, well, what did you do with this, and how was this for you? And even just, I was 27 when I got sober, and I remember saying to her, like, I still have some of my 20s left, like maybe I'm doing this too early. And she was like, how do you think I felt? Like right. She was 21. Like I just have such a, oh my God, such a greater appreciation for how young she did it. But no, she was so supportive, and I think she always knew it was something I was going to need to do eventually because she saw the red flags, but I don't think she realized at the time how much I was struggling with it.
You know, it's interesting. It's one of the regrets I have is I never talked to my mother about her getting sober. And I'm not sure why, right? And I'm not sure why I didn't do that. And it's one of the regrets I have. Like, I've never said, because like I said, as far as I know, my mom didn't do anything. And I'm sure and that's what I mean. I'm sure she did something, right? Whether, even if it was, she was very religious and faithful to a religion, even if it was just that. But I never talked to her about that. And I think early on, that's a little bit my story, where when I first came into AA, I didn't stay around for that long.
Right.
Even though I didn't drink for a long time, I didn't stay in the program for a long time. And I don't know if there was shame involved with that or what, but I'm really happy that you had that time with your mom. Is to share that. Yeah. Right. To share that. And like you said, because we talk about it all the time, right? Non-alcoholics cannot understand how we think and what we're going through, right? My wife can have a couple glasses of wine. She's not an alcoholic, right? She can buy a bottle of wine and it could sit in the fridge for 4 days. It wouldn't sit in the fridge for 40 minutes for me. And I'm not even kidding. Like, it wouldn't make 40 minutes, never mind 4 days.
Right.
So she can't understand it. She doesn't understand how that works. But if I talk to Matt or somebody else or yourself, you guys understand how we feel, right? And that's what it is. It's about the feelings, right? That's what a lot of us drink, because we drink over our feelings. So yeah, it's really special. Really
This
good
was going to
stuff.
be my question, but I checked as we were talking. So if you want to hear from Madeline's mom, it's episode 4 of Happiest Sober Podcast. It's the next thing I'm going to listen to because your mom, Megan, sounds like she is awesome.
She is, and she shares her story in episode 4, but she comes back on all the time. I call her my like part-time co-host because I bring her on all the time. So it's so fun.
Oh,
Those
what
are
a
my favorite
resource.
episodes.
Yeah.
I mean, she sounds like a black belt Al-Anon to be able to handle you in such a way without codependency. And I'm not sure I have it in me right now. Maybe I do, but if they came, I would fall apart. I
You
would
think
not,
so?
because I would feel failure that I did something that led them, that I passed on these inferior genes to these kids, which I adore, and they have the same affliction as me. It's the number one thing I was thinking about when I got sober, that I do not want them to suffer the way I did. I want to do everything possible not to have them suffer, and that's not realistic. But hearing how your mom handled you, what an emotionally intelligent way to go about that.
Yeah. And you know what? If it brings you any peace about those feelings, I'm really grateful. I'm grateful that I struggled with alcohol because if I hadn't, I wouldn't have gotten sober. And I like my life a lot better like this. So it doesn't have to mean failure at all. It's something that brings me a lot of joy that me and my mom share this sober thing together.
Right, and I agree. Like, you get to share something. Not that I'm wishing that your kids become alcoholics, Matt, because I'm not. Because I got a couple kids of my own, and it's the same thing. It's one of the things I worried about. I don't think I have that anxiety over you because I have no choice what genes get passed on to my kids. I mean, I only have the genes I have, and if there is a gene effect, if there is some type of, then there's nothing I can do about it. But neither of my kids drink to excess. They both drink some. And again, they've known me. They know my struggles, and they know this podcast. And I told both of my kids, I'm like, "Hey, I'm doing this podcast. Listen if you want," because they never heard the stories.
Wow!
I've never told my kids like the horror stories, and I'm like, "Listen at your own peril." Right? Like, you're gonna hear stuff that you're gonna hear stuff that you didn't know, and maybe aren't so pleasant about your dad. And I remember my daughter saying, "Is it okay if I listen?" I'm like, "Absolutely, go ahead, listen right away." 'Cause I'm very open on this, and I talk about whatever it is. So,
Well, that's cool that now they can learn if they want to.
right, and they
bit more
know.
about it.
So, and absolutely, and I too hope that my kids never struggle with it. And if they do, they know, they know where they can go for help. And they know that
That's the thing. If they
right.
do, then they're set up great for it with having sober
They do.
parents, right? So
Yep,
yeah.
absolutely.
Although we're AA people, we're curious about other ways that people get sober. We talk a lot of AA stuff because it's just what we know. In your podcast, you talked a little bit about that you went to some meetings. It doesn't sound like that's your main method of staying sober. Kind of curious your experience in the rooms and what is it about it that may not have worked, and what do you do to keep sober? What's your process of recovery?
So I have never been to AA, and nothing against AA. Got my mom sober, got my dad sober, by the way. He's 8 years sober now. And I went to the Luckiest Club meetings in the beginning, and I stayed in them for maybe
Got it. Okay, so that's what I misunderstood.
Yeah, I
What's
went
the
to
Luckiest Club?
So that's the one that Laura McCowan started, who
Gotcha.
wrote We Are the Luckiest. So she started during the pandemic. She started like a virtual support group over Zoom. So I went to those meetings. They got me through my first kind of few months of figuring it out. And I don't know, I just kind of hit a point where I was like, okay, like I think I didn't feel like I needed to necessarily go anymore. And where I have found community is, I mean, first my mom, like I have such a support system in her, and she's been my go-to. I guess she's my unofficial sponsor. And honestly, sober Instagram was a game changer for me. It helped me in the beginning to just read sober accounts, like before I even quit drinking, when I was struggling with kind of knowing I needed to, but not being ready yet. I would be like hungover, shame spiraling, and I would go like read people's sober accounts, and they really kind of inspired me and comforted me. And so I started mine really early in my sobriety, and it ended up, I didn't realize when I started it that it would be this, but it ended up being my greatest accountability tool. And the kind of community that I found there has been, I think my number one thing, for sure. So I think, my mom, reading a lot, and then being really involved, and I've kind of just, I guess just kind of created my own community online.
What was that process of starting the Instagram? Because that's overwhelming, and you have one hell of a following. How did you do that?
You know what? I was like not even a month sober yet when I started it. And I started it anonymously at first. I was too scared to put my face on it for the first 6 months. I was terrified of anyone who I know in real life finding it for the first long time. I didn't even tell people in my life about it until I'd been doing it for probably well over a year. But I just started showing up there and posting every day, and it was helpful. I made connections on there. I made sober friends on there. I made sober friends who I then met in real life on there. It was sort of just an outlet for me to kind of like journal and write about where I was at in my sobriety. And I don't know. I just have showed up consistently there for over 2.5 years now. And kind of just.
I did an Instagram live recently. Because Jill told me I've got to do this regularly. So I'm doing it because the accountability of this is she's trying to help me grow the show. And she's like, you need to do this, you need to do that. And I don't want to deal with her nonsense if I don't do this stuff. So I did something. I've recently been diagnosed with ADHD, which is not a shock. I was sure I had this. And I think I mentioned it in passing. And that was the thing that had some of the most engagement in like the longest period of time.
Wow.
Like people came out of the woodwork. I got direct messages about it. And I'm like, I have no idea what I'm going to put out there that either is going to get people connected, have them feel helped, or have them reach out and say, hey, I'd like to help you. You can try this, this, and this. Like I felt like it came out of left field. I'm like, that's the thing that got you engaged.
Wow.
And I'm always shocked. I never know what's going to connect.
It can be totally unpredictable. And sometimes it's just the algorithm that's unpredictable.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just something in particular that resonates with a lot of people, which it sounds like that was. So that's really cool.
So you did a podcast before the current one. How did you get involved with that? Because I know that one's not going anymore.
Yeah, it was one that I started with a really good friend of mine who I met on Sober Instagram, and we just kind of did it together for fun. And and then kind of both of our schedules got a bit crazy and hectic, and we're in different time zones. But it was a lot of fun. And then now I'm doing the Happiest Sober one.
So it sounds like you started Happiest Sober like out of nowhere. Listening to your first episode, it's like I was thinking of doing this, but I didn't know, so I just decided to hit record, and here I am.
Yeah, that's honestly how, like, I always knew in my head for probably like a year before I did it that I wanted to start that podcast. And I had talked to my mom about like, maybe I'll start one and then we could do one together. And I just one day, I don't know, I was listening to another podcast and I was like, I kind of want to like play around with what my first episode would be. And I just recorded it and didn't know if I would even do anything with it, if I would keep that one. And then it was my 2 years sober in November. And I was like, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to so I just uploaded it on a total whim, and then have just kind of been going from there. So it's funny because I just kind of put that out. So it's just been very on a kind of week to week basis because I didn't have any planning. I didn't have any episodes pre-recorded before I started it. So I've kind of been figuring it out as I go, but it's fun. I really love doing the podcast.
I think that's the best way to do it. There's something to be said with having a plan. There's also something to be said with having some spontaneity. If you're in some type of meeting, however you get sober, one thing I learned is if you want to share something, raise your hand early because then you're not thinking about what you're going to say the rest of the time. And two, sometimes you just have to open your mouth and say something, and it's another one of these things. You don't know what's going to connect and help somebody else.
For sure.
So sometimes that spontaneity just makes for a better episode.
It's true. That's well said.
Matt and I do that a lot. We just show up like, hey, what are we going to talk about tonight? Literally, like, what do you think? Or we'll text each other, hey, what do you think? And then we'll kick around some ideas, and then we start talking about it. And most of the time we get done with it and we think, oh, that was pretty good. All right. And we don't know. Like I always say, I put it out to the universe and let them decide what's good and what's not good. I can't decide that. So, hopefully we always say, hopefully somebody can listen and get something out of it. That's what we do it for, right? Somebody can listen and get help for that day, for that episode. And if somebody does, then I'm satisfied with it.
Oh my God, I totally agree. And it's a very good practice at like kind of letting go of ego and getting out of your head, because especially like sometimes I do solo episodes where I listen after and I put it out and I'm just like, this is shit. I have a vulnerability hangover. I don't think this is any good. I'm just putting it out, whatever. And then I'll get at least like one message like, thanks for this. I needed to hear this today. And I'm like, okay, it was worth it then.
We say that all the time when we get a message or an email from somebody. It's like, all right, well, I guess it's worth it. I'll show up next week. I'll show up next week and we'll do it again.
Yeah, for sure. So.
Yeah, the key, we're getting, again, podcast business stuff, but I think the key is you got to grind it out. You got to be a cockroach. You have to survive the nuclear blast and just keep doing it week in and week out and just never stop. And that's how you make the connection.
Right.
Yeah. It's true. Just showing up and like, it's a good practice in kind of letting go of perfectionism and like self-criticism of just like, however you show up is how you show up, and just trust that, hopefully it'll help at least one person who's listening.
So tell me a little bit about Happiest Sober Hub. What's this all about? Sell me on this. What am I going to get if I'm looking to get sober if I join for Happiest Sober Hub?
Yeah. Oh, so Happiest Sober Hub is my support group. I started doing support groups. I did like a 6-week holiday one over the holidays, like 6-week support group, get you through the holidays without drinking. And then I did a 12-week group at the start of this year. And as it was coming to an end, I didn't want it to end. The people in the group were voicing that they didn't want it to end. And I was like, I love this. I want to just keep going. So it's an amazing community. We meet twice a week on Zoom and then have like a private Facebook group where we connect. And yeah, it's such an amazing group of people, such a like positive, supportive space where people can just kind of like show up as they are and talk about whatever they're going through and connect with each other. And yeah, it's my favorite thing that I do. I love it.
See, those are the things that Matt and I are so intrigued by, right? Because, we went down to the church basement and we got sober in that manner. And because these things weren't available. They certainly weren't available when I got sober,
right?
Especially the first time in the '90s, and they weren't really available much even when Matt got sober, a little bit, but not the communities that are out there. And now you have this whole another community, like you said, that you can meet, and then you can find this group of people that you never physically, for many of them, probably met. Yet you can help each other not only get and stay sober, but have a happy life about it.
Yes.
Right? Which is what we always talk about in AA. It's like, I don't go to AA so much not to drink, although I always have to be aware of that. I go to AA so that I can make sure that my life, I can live the best life I possible, right? Yeah. That's what I go for. And we hear these stories, because I'm not part of that community. I don't do that. And I'm not interested in doing that at this point in my life. But I love that community is out there. I love that one person, can start that and draw in all these other people, and then those other people in their own way can go out and help other people, which is sort of a little bit like the AA, grow it up and you pass it on type of deal in a different manner. And I love it personally. I know a lot of old timers don't love it. They think AA is the only way, and that's fine. I get that, but
you're a real crumb bum.
Yeah, that's what he says.
You're a crumb creep.
Right. That's what they say. But it's fascinating to me. So congratulations to you for doing that.
Oh, thank you. And oh my gosh, I totally agree with what you said. And I love that, because that's my whole kind of thing is like, it's not about getting sober and being miserable and feeling like you're missing out for the rest of your life. It's about getting sober and realizing you can live a happier life because of it. And yeah, it's I think AA is amazing and it helps a lot of people, but I love that there are other options.
Me too.
Because different things are going to work for different people and different things are going to resonate with different people. And at the end of the day, the thing that I think makes AA powerful is community. And
Right.
that's exactly what kind of all the other options are now too, our sense of
Right.
community. And I've met some people from my group in real life now and like have made such amazing connections. And we're talking about trying to plan a little weekend somewhere at some point. It's really, really, really cool.
Is there a demographic? Is it like all women of a certain age, or is it all over the map?
So it's not just women, but not necessarily a certain demographic. Yeah, we kind of have people of all ages in there. Yeah.
I'm just always curious about that. And I find it ends up being like that because the only thing you really have to have in common is you have a problem with drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that cuts across all demographics.
Yes.
And I just like, Steve is like, he's 75 years older than me.
Yeah.
And we can have a conversation being, he's in the December of his years. So, and I'm very young. And we can have those conversations because it doesn't matter because
Yes.
we had a problem with alcohol. That's enough.
It really is the truth, right? I mean, it's how we identify. It's how we identify with that problem into our lives, right? It's not the only way we identify, obviously, but it's how we identify with that problem. And that once you can put aside some of the other things, the differences of people, and you can focus on that. Like, that's what we have in common. That's what we're doing here. I get, I'm sure you have it too. I've gotten help from so many strange places, right? People much younger than me, people with much less years of sobriety than me. Like, there's just so much help out there if you allow yourself to be helped.
Yeah.
And that's qualified people just because of either how old they are or how long they've been sober or whatever. Like, if you don't qualify those people, then you have an opportunity to learn something all the time.
For sure. It is such a common bond. Like, it doesn't matter at all how old somebody is or like I feel like it's an instant connector. This is like one of my favorite things I've ever done. I hosted a sober trip to Costa Rica in May. And we literally had people on that trip in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Like, the youngest girl was 21, turned 22 on our trip, had her 22nd birthday on our trip. And we all left there such good friends. We keep in touch. It's so, age is so irrelevant with sobriety, I think. And I think that's so cool because it is such an instant bond with people.
What you're doing with these trips, which is fantastic, is you're showing people that they still can have fun. In my view, I have more fun. I have more.
Me too.
The only way I could have fun is I had to get over my fear, my anxiety, my shyness, my introversion by drinking. So I felt, well, I don't have that tool. No, I replaced the tool with other things so I can now feel more comfortable going and doing stuff. So this is a really great thing, doing like a sober trip with people, saying, I can learn with other people who can hold my hand in how to have a fun and fulfilling life without alcohol. Mm-hmm. And if you're identifying with this, I'm going to skip to the end. It ends up being more fun than when you were drinking. You'll realize that after.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
Well, Madeline, I was listening to one of your episodes, and you talked about something, and I think we all have the same thing. For those of us who struggle with alcohol, okay, is that you were never present in places, right?
Yes.
So because either you were drinking and probably drinking too much, right? And there's anxiety and stuff over that, or you just couldn't wait for the drinking to start. So you were just never present. So when you would do that trip to Costa Rica or something like that, like you would always be thinking, oh, we're out in this beautiful land. I wonder when I'm going to get back to the hotel and I could start drinking. Mm-hmm. Right. And then once you get rid of that, like you can go there and just enjoy the trip and the people so much more.
The possibilities.
I know than I ever could before. I mean, I just spent my whole time just trying to make sure I had liquor available to me, make sure I had alcohol, make sure I had enough of it, make sure when am I going to be able to start? All those type of things. It was tough to manage that stuff, especially away from home. especially away from home. So
Yeah.
those really are cool trips, and it's a nice way to do it, and let everybody know that we can have not only a lot of fun, but probably a lot more fun than if alcohol was involved.
100%. And that was one thing when I got sober that I spiraled about, was like, how am I ever going to travel? Because traveling revolved around drinking for me. That was like what I would be excited to do, was to like go drink on vacation. And the first trip I ever took sober was just like a little trip to New York. But I remember just sitting in Central Park and being like, wow, I'm actually like here. I'm not like, okay, like we saw Central Park, let's go find a patio and start drinking. Like I'm actually just here. I'm not rushing through anything. Like it's so much better. So much better.
New York is mind-blowing, and going sober and having that open-mindedness if you're not used to big cities. I don't care. You could be in Toronto. New York City is Toronto is not New York City. New York City is something special, and it can be overwhelming. Are you knocking
Toronto, Matt?
I am not knocking Toronto. Toronto's a place I would love to go. I'm just saying there is nothing like New York City.
New York is a very cool city. Yeah.
Madeline, how can we find you? Where are all your contacts?
Yes, I'm on Instagram at Happiest Sober. My podcast is Happiest Sober Podcast. It's on all podcast platforms, and then my website is happiestsober.com. That's where you can subscribe to my newsletter and then sign up for Happiest Sober Hub.
If you're a 50-year-old guy and you may think, well, Madeline is really young and she's female and I'm not going to relate. She had an episode where she talked about relapse, and it was about another girl, but I could identify. You're going to be able to identify no matter who you are. And what I love about you, Madeline, is you're so positive, you're so upbeat, and there's no woe is me. There's just a vibe of welcoming and like happiness that you could have this too. So I highly encourage people to go listen to you.
Oh, thank you so much. And all of that right back at you.
Yeah.
You guys are so fun to chat with.
I'm going to put everything in the notes if you didn't write this down, so everything will be there. Madeline, thank you so much for coming on with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so fun.
We'll see everybody next week. Bye, everybody. You made it this far into the podcast. That tells me you're a pretty big fan. If you like what we do and you find value in the podcast, consider a donation at buymeacoffee.com/soberfriendspod. Your donation keeps us on the air to help out the new guy and helps us defray some of our costs. If you find value in our podcast, please consider a donation at buymeacoffee.com/soberfriendspod.